Let me just start by giving you some facts about Sweden to remind you. Of course, you all know this, but Sweden is the third largest country in the European Union, next to France and Spain. According to this map, it looked like Sweden is even bigger than France and Spain, but I think it has something to do with the projection. It's not Peter's projection, it's probably some imperialistic Nordic projection in this map. It's a large country, but the population is only 9.6 million inhabitants. That means that large areas are sparsely populated, specifically up in the north. In the northern part of Sweden, we have only 5% of the inhabitants, and in the southern part is 95% of the inhabitants. In the municipalities up in the north, you have 0.3 inhabitants per square kilometers, and in the Stockholm area, you have between 3,000 and 4,000 inhabitants per square kilometer. So there are huge differences in the regions, which is a tremendous challenge when you want to implement culture policy. In Sweden now we have a government, a coalition between the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, the Centre Party and the Christian Democrats. They are in their second mandate period, but before that we had a Social Democrat government who ruled together with the Left and the Green Party. But there are not huge differences in culture policy. You would imagine, if you go back to ideologies, that there would be a huge difference, but there are not really that many political issues that stands between the two blocks. We have election in Sweden next year, but I don't foresee, even if there will be a change in government, I don't foresee a huge change in culture policy. Public expenditures on culture is 2,630 million euros. And Sweden is one of the 7 countries in the European Union that actually increased their expenditures on culture with 25% over the last 10 years, 2.5% per year. Not a huge amount, but compared to other countries, still fairly good. And from a fairly good starting point, so to speak, as well. I'll also just give you a short presentation of how cultural affairs is organized in Sweden. Of course, we have the Minister of Culture who develops the national aims and objectives, sets the framework for the policy area, allocates resources, and also implement some programs like creative schools program, like other programs, and so on. We have 21 national agencies for culture in the culture sector. And the main task of those agencies are to execute the national culture policy. All but one has to execute the policy, and the exception is the agency that I represent, because we are evaluating the national policy and the effects of the culture policy. The most important agencies are the Swedish Arts Council and the Swedish National Heritage Board, if you count to the amount of money that they get and that they distribute in the country. Then we have 21 regions. I hope this will work, yeah. And the most important task for the regions is to develop cultural development plans. And this is fairly new. Started 3 years ago with some of the regions, and now it's implemented in all regions in Sweden except one, except the Stockholm region, and I will tell you why later on. We also have 290 municipalities that will, of course, also be responsible for the cultural activities in the municipalities. The cultural development plans, they should describe the aims, objectives, and strategies for developing all areas of culture in the region for the coming 3 years. And the important thing with these documents are not the documents per se, it's rather the way they are developed, because they are developed in cooperation with regional and local politicians, of course, civil servants, culture institutions, professional artists, civil society, and local industry. And the key word here is dialogue. This should create a dialogue between all interested parties on a regional level. Once they have started to develop the regional development plans, they are also negotiated with the Swedish Arts Council, who actually sits on the money, so to speak. And they have some ideas of what should be in the different development plans, and they communicate also through a dialogue to develop these plans. And once they are satisfied in the regions and they're satisfied at the Swedish Arts Council, the documents form the basis for distribution of state cultural funding to the regions. This is formally called the cultural cooperation model, but most commonly it's known as the suitcase model. That is, in the beginning, when it was introduced, it was called the suitcase model. But when the regions found out that there weren't that much money which they had hoped for, they started to call it the briefcase model instead, because a briefcase is a little bit smaller than a suitcase. And as I said, all regions in Sweden have now joined. It started with 5 regions in 2011. There were another 11 regions joining the model in 2012. And this year, we have the remaining regions, all but Stockholm, in the model. It's voluntary to be in the model, but most of the regions, everyone except one, have decided to join the model. The model, to put it short, means that state cultural funding to the regions come in one suitcase, so to speak, or one briefcase, as a lump sum. And the regions can decide on how to use the money. They are not earmarked by the government for certain purposes. But of course, the idea is that they should fund what they want to do according to their cultural development plans. And those also form the basis for distributing the money. So if you're in a region, write a very good development plan, you can get more money from the state. Or if the state thinks that this is not that good or not so creative, they can get less money. So there is, in a way, a competition also between the regions to get more money. The only formal demand on the regions is that certain areas of culture identified by the government should be covered in the plans. They have to write something about, of course, music, about theater, dance, and whatever, but they also have to write something about archives and libraries, and I mean the whole spectrum of culture should be covered in the development plans. Why did Sweden introduce this? Well, it wasn't because there was problems in any way. Most things worked fairly well before this model was introduced. So it was from something good to something better. And the most obvious reason was this model would recognize regional variation, and regions will be able to set their own priorities. We want to put money in this and not so much money in that. Cooperation between regions, cooperation between municipalities and regions, between municipalities, between institutions, civil society, cooperation between art forms and artists will increase. That was one other rationale behind the model. Decisions about how to use resources will come closer to the professionals, closer to the potential users, and hopefully be better decisions. And the dialogue will create understanding and respect between artists and art forms and all interested parties. That was the general idea when this was launched. But there were some initial warnings and critique. First of all, at national level, some would say that the regions don't have the competence to do this in all the different areas of culture. There was also a warning that ignorant politicians and bureaucrats will interfere in creative processes, not keeping the arm's-length distance. And bureaucracy and administrative costs will increase as a result of this model. Equal access to culture cannot be guaranteed. There will be too much differences between the different regions. And state power and control will still be strong, maybe even stronger, because the regions have to write down in their plans how they will try to implement the national aims and objectives in the cultural plans for the regions. Some even said that this reform is just a strategy to prepare for cuts in the state expenditures on culture, moving conflicts from the central area, the government, to become conflicts in the regional, at the regional and local level. Shall we have a symphony orchestra in Malmö? Shall we have an opera house in Umeå? And so on. It's based on state funding, but if you have to decide on regional levels, you will also have the conflicts at regional level or even at local level. But the outcome so far is fairly positive. You see, the Swedish king was very happy when he heard about this, made thumbs up. Yes, this is good. People are rather optimistic. We have evaluated the first results from this reform, and people are rather optimistic. They say that variety, accessibility, and quality of culture will improve as a result of the model. When decisions come closer, they are also more happy with the decisions. But more important, perhaps, is that the concrete work with the culture development plans had put culture higher up on the political agenda. People start talking about culture and culture politics at municipal level and also at the regional level. Culture has also been recognized as an important attractor in some regions, something that makes a region interesting, make people want to live there, stay there. It's not just about jobs, it's not just about schooling, it's not just about housing. Culture becomes more and more important to attract the people that should build a region or a society or a municipality. And cultural development plans are sometimes coordinated with more general regional development plans, where culture is seen as the driving force in the local and regional economy. That is what we wanted to accomplish, but it wasn't one of the sort of rationales behind the model. This we have seen later on, that this is really important to get something to happen. But the king isn't always happy. Of course, there also are some problems. There has been an increase in administrative costs, especially at regional level. So far, there have been very few changes in the way resources are actually distributed. Although the regions have the power to reallocate resources, they don't do it in a very high degree. And state governance of regional culture policy remains strong, even if regional and municipal influence is growing. And of course, the magic question is, what will happen if there will be cuts in the state expenditure on culture? So far, there has been an increase all the time, feeding into the model, making all the people happy. Oh, more money. But if they have to start cutting at regional and local level, what will happen then? Some of these problems are not necessarily viewed as problems. An increase in administrative cost is also capacity building on regional and local level. There are more people working with culture in the regions and in the municipalities. And state power and control, state governance of region culture doesn't have to be a bad thing. They could guarantee more equal access to culture and so on. So the state influence could be also viewed as positive in a way. So, some conclusions. What we can see is a kind of cultural empowerment of regions and municipalities. Decentralization of economic capital for culture leads to decentralization of culture capital in a Bourdieu'sque terminology, and capacity building at local and regional level. The work with the regional cultural development plans lead to a dialogue and engagement in culture policy issues and more cross-sectorial cooperation. Hopefully, and this is so far just a hope, hopefully this will contribute to regional development and economic growth, but this remains to be seen. Our agency will closely follow what will happen in this respect. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing with us your fears and your hopes, and it is really evident that you are going to have a lot of work. And what came to my mind is I mentioned in the beginning what I find as the main culture policy problem, that is supply-driven cultural production, where resulted in oversupply of cultural services and goods. Perhaps this concept could bring us closer to demand-driven cultural production, and if so, this could be very challenging also for others. So thank you very much.